Oakwood Estates, a suburban nightmare. Mark, a single father and dedicated paramedic, longed for the tranquility of suburban life in Oakwood Estates. He cherished peace and order, yet his patience wore thin when faced with the suffocating grip of unnecessary bureaucracy. The neighborhood initially presented an idyllic facade: perfectly manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets, mailboxes stood in unwavering alignment, and an air of exclusivity hung heavy in the air. However, Mark soon discovered that the serenity came at a steep price, a price embodied by one woman, Karen Delacroix. Karen wasn't merely the HOA president. She was the self-proclaimed queen of Oakwood Estates, ruling with an iron fist cloaked in floral prints and perfectly coiffed hair. Her dominion extended to the most minute details, from the precise shade of autumnal wreaths to the exact height of porch lights, measured in fractions of an inch. Control was her oxygen, and she reveled in issuing violation notices for the most insignificant infractions. Whispers about Karen circulated like chilling urban legends. Neighbors recounted tales of a homeowner forced to repaint their entire house because the beige was deemed too assertive, or the time Karen personally measured individual blades of grass, issuing fines with a triumphant glint in her eye. Mark, a man who generally avoided confrontation, had his first run-in with Karen when he politely inquired about the bi-weekly security gate code changes. The constant updates were a major inconvenience, especially for residents like him who worked grueling late shifts. Karen responded with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her icy blue eyes, explaining in a condescending tone that it was for security reasons. Mark let it slide, but the veiled hostility in her gaze made it clear he had been marked as a troublemaker. For the most part, Mark tried to stay out of her way. His life revolved around his demanding job and his precious 12-year-old son, Ben. Ben, who had battled asthma since he was a toddler, was the primary reason Mark had chosen this gated community. He had been assured it was safe, quiet, and ideal for families. The endless rules and regulations, no matter how absurd, seemed a small sacrifice for Ben's well-being. But then, the unsettling incidents began. First, one night after an exhausting shift, Mark's security gate code inexplicably failed to work. He was forced to call the HOA emergency line, where Karen's voice, dripping with insincere apology, coolly informed him that his code had been accidentally removed from the system. Then came the fines: petty, clearly targeted violations. A stern warning about his trash cans being a mere half-inch too close to the curb. A notice claiming his porch light was too bright, despite being identical to his neighbor's. Each complaint felt like a calculated pinprick, designed to wear him down, to force him into submission. Mark endured it, his focus solely on Ben. Everything shattered on a night that began like any other. Mark had just returned from a particularly brutal shift and was starting to prepare a simple dinner when he heard the unmistakable, terrifying wheeze emanating from Ben's room. His son's asthma had been relatively stable lately, but it could flare up with cruel unpredictability. Mark's heart leaped into his throat. He raced to the bathroom cabinet to grab Ben's inhaler, his hand reaching for the familiar plastic casing only to find empty space. Panic seized him. He frantically searched every possible place, tearing through couch cushions, emptying drawers, his mind a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. He could have sworn he had a backup. Had he been too exhausted from work to pick up the refill? Ben's breathing grew more shallow, each gasp a desperate plea for air. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. "This is an emergency. My son is having a severe asthma attack. We need an ambulance now." The dispatcher's calm voice assured him paramedics were on their way. Mark's house was easy to locate, but a cold dread settled in his stomach as he remembered the one insurmountable obstacle: the gate. He sprinted outside, his lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to reach the entrance, had to guide the ambulance in without delay. But as he arrived at the gatehouse, his worst fears materialized. Karen Delacroix stood at the control panel, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression an unreadable mask of self-importance. The cold, blue glow of the security screen reflected off her perfectly manicured nails. "Karen." An ambulance is coming for my son. Open the gate. Mark's voice was raw with desperation. Karen tilted her head, a slow, infuriation smirk spreading across her face. Oh, Mark. HOA protocol clearly states that emergency vehicles must have authorization to enter. Mark could barely comprehend her words. You can't be serious. My son can't breathe. Open the damn gate. She gave an exaggerated sigh, tapping a crimson-painted fingernail against the panel. Rules are rules, Mark. You know that. We had an unfortunate incident last year with unauthorized vehicles, and we simply cannot have people taking advantage of emergency services for minor inconveniences. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. A minor inconvenience? He's having an asthma attack. He could die. Karen remained utterly unperturbed, shrugging with an air of detached superiority. Then perhaps you should have ensured you had proper medical supplies at home. We all have responsibilities. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, sending a fleeting wave of relief through Mark. But as he turned towards the approaching ambulance, Karen calmly pressed a button on the keypad. The heavy gates shuddered, and the ominous click of the lock echoed in the tense silence. Mark's breath hitched. What the hell are you doing? She folded her arms, her smirk widening. The HOA board has to approve emergency vehicle access in non-fire situations. I'd love to help, really, but if I make an exception for you, then where do we draw the line? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The ambulance, its lights flashing urgently, screeched to a halt on the other side of the imposing metal barrier. The paramedics inside, their faces etched with concern, tried to communicate through the bars. One of them, a young woman with determined eyes, shouted, "We need to get in there now. Can you open the gate?" Mark spun back to Karen, his voice trembling with fury. "You're playing games with my son's life." Karen's smirk remained unwavering. "I'm enforcing the rules." Mark didn't wait another second. Without conscious thought, fueled by a primal fear for his child, he bolted towards the gate. He gripped the cold metal bars, his muscles straining as he hoisted himself over the formidable barrier. Karen shrieked in outrage. "This is trespassing. You're violating HOA property." Mark ignored her frantic cries. He landed hard on the other side, his knees buckling slightly, and then he was sprinting towards the ambulance. The paramedics, seeing his desperate urgency, grabbed their equipment and, without hesitation, scaled the gate themselves, their determination mirroring his own. Behind them, Karen was screaming into her phone, her voice shrill with fury. "Security! Police! Mark Henderson is breaking the law and endangering this community." Mark's blood boiled, but he had no time to waste. He and the medics raced back towards his house. Inside, Ben was gasping for air, his face pale and clammy, his small frame trembling as he fought for each precious breath. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, administering oxygen and preparing a nebulizer treatment. Mark knelt beside his son, gripping his small hand. "You're going to be okay, buddy. Just hang in there." As the medicine began to take effect, Ben's breathing gradually eased. Relief washed over Mark in a dizzying wave, but his hands still trembled with a potent cocktail of rage, fear, and the sheer helplessness he had felt just moments ago. A sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile peace. Mark turned to see two uniformed police officers standing on his porch. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms folded, a smug look plastered across her face. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report about unauthorized trespassing and disorderly conduct." Mark couldn't believe it. He had just fought to save his son's life, and now he was being treated like a criminal. Karen stepped forward, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "It's so unfortunate, officers. I warned him about our rules, but he just refused to listen. He was completely out of control, scaling gates, causing a scene. You know, we have these rules for a reason." Mark felt his stomach churn with disgust. The audacity of this woman was beyond comprehension. He turned to the officers, his voice low and steady, like tempered steel. "My son was having a medical emergency. She locked the gate and refused to open it for the ambulance. She put his life at risk." One of the paramedics, still tending to Ben, looked up, her voice firm. "That's the truth. We could have lost precious minutes. It was reckless and completely unnecessary." The officers exchanged a look, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. Karen scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come now. His son is fine, isn't he? No real harm done. But property damage, violating HOA security policies, that's a different matter entirely." Mark clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. This woman had nearly cost him his son, and she was still acting like she was in the right. But for the first time, Karen's carefully constructed confidence wavered as neighbors began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. A few had been watching the ordeal unfold from their windows, and now murmurs of disbelief and anger spread through the small crowd. Some whispered amongst themselves, their faces etched with horror. Karen's expression darkened as she realized something. This time, she had gone too far. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Mark stood in his doorway, his fists clenched at his sides, watching the officers hesitate. His son was still lying on the couch, his breathing shallow but steady, recovering from the asthma attack that could have been fatal had the ambulance been delayed any longer. But instead of arresting the woman who had deliberately blocked emergency medical care, the police seemed to be considering whether he was in the wrong for breaking through the gate. Karen stood smugly behind them, arms crossed, waiting for Mark to be punished for defying her authority. The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. The situation was undeniably tricky. They had received a complaint from the HOA president, but they also had an entire medical team as witnesses. One of the paramedics, the young woman who had climbed the gate alongside Mark, stepped forward, her voice resonating with righteous indignation. "With all due respect, officers, this man saved his son's life. The delay could have caused permanent damage, or worse. We were forced to climb a locked gate because this woman," she shot Karen a look of pure disdain, "refused to let emergency personnel through." Karen huffed, her composure starting to fray. "And as I already explained, we have procedures in place to allow emergency access after approval. It's not my fault that he failed to follow proper protocols." Mark's carefully maintained patience finally snapped. "Are you actually hearing yourself, Karen? My son was dying. There was no protocol. He needed help immediately." Karen rolled her eyes, her mask of fake concern slipping completely. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. His breathing's just fine now, isn't it?" A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of neighbors that had gathered. Some of them had been hesitant to get involved earlier, but now, the horrifying reality of Karen's actions was sinking in. She had actively prevented medical help from reaching a child in desperate need. One of the officers cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Karen. "Ma'am, do you realize that obstructing emergency services is a crime? If what these witnesses are saying is true, you could be facing serious consequences." Karen's face twitched, her confidence faltering for the first time. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising in indignation. "I was following HOA rules. If we don't have order, what do we have? If everyone just started letting emergency vehicles in without documentation, we'd have chaos. The rules exist for a reason." Mark's fury burned even hotter, but now he wasn't the only one who saw through her twisted logic. A voice, clear and strong, rang out from the crowd. "That's a load of garbage, Karen." It was Tom, his next-door neighbor, a usually passive man who had avoided HOA drama for years. Karen's head snapped towards him, her lips parting in shock. Tom had never spoken against her before. "You didn't stop that ambulance because of rules, Karen. You stopped it because you wanted power over Mark. You wanted to punish him for questioning your little dictatorship, and you didn't care if a kid got hurt in the process." A few heads in the crowd nodded in agreement. Someone muttered, "She did the same thing to me last year when my dad fell." the paramedics had to break the lock. Karen's eyes darted around, panic flickering in their depths. For years, she had ruled Oakwood Estates through fear and intimidation, issuing fines and threats to anyone who dared to defy her. But now, the tide was turning. Mark, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "She's done this before." A few reluctant nods rippled through the crowd. Lisa, a single mother from 3 houses down, spoke up, her voice trembling with long-suppressed anger. "I got fined for calling an ambulance last year when my daughter broke her arm. Karen said I should have driven her myself instead of disturbing the neighborhood with sirens." More murmurs of agreement followed. The stories started to emerge, small abuses of power, each one dismissed as just Karen being Karen at the time, but now they were stacking up, forming a damning pattern of cruelty and disregard for the well-being of the community. Mark turned back to the officers, his gaze unwavering. "How many times does she have to block emergency services before something is actually done about it?" One officer checked his radio, speaking quietly to dispatch. After a moment, he gave Karen a long, unreadable look. "Ma'am, we're going to have to take a formal report on this." Karen's composure finally cracked. "You can't be serious. I'm the HOA president. You should be arresting him for trespassing, not harassing me for following the rules." But even the officers weren't buying it anymore. One of them handed Mark a clipboard. "If you're willing to press charges for obstruction, we'll take this to the department." Mark didn't hesitate. "I absolutely am," Karen gasped as if she had been physically struck. "You can't do this." "I was just..." She turned to the neighbors, her eyes wide with desperation, searching for support, but no one came to her defense. Even her closest HOA allies remained silent. For the first time, Karen was truly alone. Her mouth opened and closed, her mind frantically scrambling for a way out of this rapidly unfolding nightmare. She had spent years controlling this community, issuing fines, making rules, and, in essence, ruining lives in the name of order. But she had gone too far this time, and now Mark was leading the charge against her. As the police began gathering statements from the growing number of neighbors willing to speak out, Karen's desperation intensified. "This is a mistake. I was only doing my duty. You'll all regret this." Mark crossed his arms, a grim satisfaction settling over him. "No, Karen. You will." She had built her power on fear and isolation, but now she had created an enemy she couldn't intimidate, a father who would do anything to protect his son. And he wasn't alone anymore. The moment Karen realized she was losing control, her entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the smug superiority, replaced by a frantic desperation to salvage what little authority she had left. But the damage had already been done. For years, she had ruled Oakwood Estates through intimidation, issuing absurd fines, enforcing arbitrary rules, and making examples of anyone who dared question her. But today, in front of the entire neighborhood, she had exposed herself as something far worse than a petty tyrant, a dangerous liability. As the officers continued taking statements, the neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up found their voices. Lisa stepped forward, arms crossed, a steely glint in her eyes. "So, Karen, what exactly was your excuse when my daughter broke her arm, and you wouldn't let the ambulance through? You said I should have planned better for accidents, didn't you?" Karen's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Mr. Alvarez, a retired lawyer who lived down the street, adjusted his glasses and stepped into the growing circle of residents. "I'd like to remind everyone that HOA presidents are not above the law. Blocking emergency vehicles is a criminal offense, and if multiple residents have had similar experiences, we're looking at a pattern of negligence and abuse of power." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A few people pulled out their phones, filming the scene, capturing the moment Karen's iron grip over the community crumbled before their eyes. Karen turned to her last remaining supporter, a man named Greg who had always been eager to side with her. "Greg, you know I was just doing what's best for the neighborhood, right?" Greg took a step back, shaking his head slowly. "Not this time, Karen." She turned frantically, searching for allies, But there were none left. Tom, the once neutral neighbor, crossed his arms, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Face it, Karen. You finally pissed off the wrong guy." Karen's lips curled in a snarl of rage. "You people don't understand. I keep this place running. Without me, this community would fall apart." Mark scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Funny. I think we'd be just fine without someone who nearly got a kid killed over her obsession with rules." A ripple of approval ran through the crowd. Someone muttered, "We should have gotten rid of her years ago." Sensing her power slipping beyond her grasp, Karen turned back to the police officers, her voice laced with desperation. "This is harassment. I'm the victim here." One of the officers sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, we'll be conducting an official investigation. If you're found guilty of obstructing emergency services, you'll be facing legal consequences." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. "Legal consequences?" Mr. Alvarez smirked. "That's right, Karen. And if anyone else wants to come forward about her misuse of HOA funds, I'd be more than happy to help prepare a class action lawsuit." The mention of a lawsuit sent a palpable wave of excitement through the neighbors. Karen had fined and harassed nearly everyone in Oakwood Estates. Now, they had a chance to fight back. One by one, people started stepping forward with their own stories of Karen's tyranny, excessive fines for the most trivial nonsense, a gnome being deemed too whimsical, a mailbox positioned a fraction of an inch askew. Tales of Karen spending community money on lavish personal expenses, including a state-of-the-art security system for her own house. Whispers of intimidation tactics, of Karen threatening to evict people for daring to question her decisions. The officer taking notes frowned, his pen flying across the page. "This is a lot. We're going to need to escalate this." Mark couldn't help but smile as Karen's carefully constructed empire crumbled in real time. She had spent years terrorizing this community, but now, she was the one being held accountable. Her face was a mask of pure fury, but she had no more cards to play. No one was coming to her defense. And Mark? Mark had won. Karen had spent years cementing herself as the untouchable ruler of Oakwood Estates, but now she stood frozen in the middle of the street, her power unraveling right before her eyes. The police were writing reports, her neighbors were turning against her, and worst of all, her own beloved rules were being used against her. Mark could see the precise moment the reality hit her. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips pursed into a thin, angry line, and her eyes darted between the crowd and the officers as if desperately searching for an escape route. But there was none. The residents weren't just angry anymore. They were ready for justice. Lisa stepped forward, waving her phone. "I just sent a complaint to the HOA Oversight Board. Since multiple people are reporting her blocking emergency vehicles, they have to open an inquiry." Mr. Alvarez nodded grimly. "And given the legal implications, I imagine they won't want to be associated with her much longer." Karen's nostrils flared. "You can't just we can," Tom cut in, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "You know how you always say rules are rules? Well, your own rules say an emergency HOA meeting can be called with enough complaints. And guess what?" He held up his phone. "We just sent dozens." A few others in the crowd held up their phones, confirming that Karen's reign of terror was officially over. The officers exchanged a quick glance before the taller one turned to Karen, his expression stern. "Ma'am, we need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. If this obstruction led to medical endangerment, the district attorney may be looking at criminal charges." Karen's face drained of all color. "Criminal charges?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "That's correct," the officer continued, unfazed. "And if these claims about financial misconduct hold up, you'll be facing civil suits on top of that." For the first time, Karen looked truly scared. She spun on her heels, her eyes locking onto Mark as if he were the sole architect of her downfall. "This is your fault," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You're ruining this community. I kept things organized. Mark chuckled, shaking his head slowly. "No, Karen. You did this to yourself." Her lips trembled, and for a brief second, it almost seemed like she was about to beg. But her pride, the very thing that had fueled her tyrannical reign, wouldn't allow it. Instead, she turned on her heels and marched stiffly towards her house, brushing past neighbors who no longer respected or feared her. But it wasn't over yet. Before she could reach her driveway, Greg, her former supporter, called out, a hint of glee in his voice. "Oh, Karen. I almost forgot. You're fired." Karen whirled around, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" Greg held up his phone, a smug look on his face. "The HOA board just voted to remove you as president. You're done." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Karen staggered back as if she had been physically struck. "You can't." "Oh, we did," Lisa said with a triumphant smirk. "And don't worry, a full audit of HOA funds is coming next." The final blow. Karen was officially powerless. Her reign was over. She let out an inhuman shriek of pure rage before storming inside her house, slamming the door behind her with a resounding thud. The neighborhood erupted in cheers, a collective exhale of relief after years of suffocating under her rule. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. It was finally over. The fallout from Karen's downfall was swift and satisfying. The very next morning, the HOA board sent out an official notice. Karen Delacroix had been permanently removed from all HOA leadership positions. Her security access was revoked, her finances were frozen pending a thorough investigation, and, in a delicious twist of irony, her own meticulously crafted rules were now being used against her. Mark stepped onto his porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands, watching as the cleanup of her mess began. The neighborhood that had once been eerily silent and fearful was now buzzing with life. Neighbors chatted freely, no longer afraid of being spied on or fined for the wrong shade of garden gnome. Tom, who had spent years avoiding conflict, grinned as he proudly redecorated his yard with oversized, ridiculously colorful decorations, something Karen had vehemently banned. Lisa put up a brightly colored welcome mat, knowing Karen could no longer issue citations for lack of uniformity. The changes weren't just symbolic. The HOA board announced major reforms. Emergency vehicles would have permanent, unrestricted access. Ridiculous and arbitrary fines were immediately rescinded. And a full forensic audit was underway to recover the significant amount of money Karen had misused. As for Karen, the investigation into her finances unearthed a staggering amount of embezzlement. She had brazenly diverted thousands of dollars from HOA funds for personal security upgrades, all for her own fortress-like house. With the evidence mounting, she was facing serious criminal fraud charges in addition to the charge of obstructing emergency services. Her house, which she had once patrolled like a personal fiefdom, was now her gilded cage. The woman who had spent years controlling the neighborhood was now trapped inside, afraid to show her face. A week later, Mark watched as a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. She was leaving. Karen Delacroix, once the most feared figure in Oakwood Estates, was now packing up her life in utter disgrace. Greg, her former ally, leaned against his car, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on his face. Guess she couldn't handle living under her own rules. Lisa chuckled. I wonder if the next neighborhood she moves to has an HOA. Tom roared with laughter. If they do, you can bet she won't be in charge of it. As Karen climbed into the back of the moving truck, she shot one last, venomous glare at Mark, her eyes seething with resentment. But this time, he didn't feel anger, only a profound sense of satisfaction. He raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. Safe travels, Karen. Don't let the HOA violations hit you on the way out. The neighbors who had gathered to witness her departure erupted in laughter. And as Karen's truck disappeared down the street, a collective sigh of relief washed over Oakwood Estates. For the first time in years, the community belonged to its residents again. Mark turned back towards his house, where Ben was sitting on the porch, his breathing clear and easy. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood felt freer. And as he closed his front door, he knew one thing for sure: Karen Delacroix would never be a problem again. Valuable lesson: this story serves as a powerful reminder that rules and regulations, while often necessary, should never supersede common sense and basic human decency. True community thrives on compassion and cooperation, not on the rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules by those seeking power and control. When authority is misused and empathy is absent, the consequences can be dire. It takes courage for individuals to stand up against tyranny, but when they do, the power of a united community can overcome even the most entrenched oppression. What are your thoughts on Karen's actions? Have you ever experienced anything similar in your own neighborhood? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content.